Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's EDA University Center sponsored Lunch and Learn. We're happy to see all the faces and names come across this morning as people are signing in. We have a couple of changes that are going on with the EDA University Center Lunch and Learn. The only one that really pertains to us is that beginning next week, we will issue an invitation with a passcode in order to allow us to increase the security level. Although it hasn't happened to anyone that I'm aware of at the Community Development Institute, there have been some instances of Zoom bombing, and we're hoping that that doesn't happen and increasing our security and response. So if you're on the regular distribution list for this Lunch and Learn, you'll receive updated information on Friday about that. If you are getting the information secondhand, we are going through all of our previous Zooms to call names to make sure that we're contacting our regular visitors from outside of the Community Development Institute. So with that, housekeeping aside, I'm very excited to welcome you here today. Tessa Conroy is going to be presenting some data and information on one of the issues that has been absolutely critical to our survival as an economic development and community development community, and that is broadband. So with that, Tessa, I'll turn the floor over to you.
I think, excuse me, thanks, Kristen, and hello, everybody. So yes, I'll be talking about broadband in rural economic development, and this is something that I've been thinking about through a research project for about a year now, and just realizing how big of a space this is, and there are lots of moving parts. So today I just wanted to share with you what I've been thinking about and what I've been learning the most about, but I know that there are many other facets of this topic. I tried to keep my slides down so that we have plenty of time to chat and share. I know a lot of you are working on initiatives with your own communities, and I think those all look a little bit different. So looking forward to hearing from you. And I think we also have Jeff Glazer on the phone. Jeff, are you with us? Let's see, he might be muted. Hopefully Jeff was able to join us. I met Jeff through the Law and Entrepreneurship Clinic. He's a clinical associate professor at the law school, and he's done some work on our municipal laws and how those limit and restrict broadband. If he's able to join us, it would be great to maybe hear from him for a couple minutes and can help us understand kind of the legal parameters around what we can do with broadband in the state. So with that, I'll get started. All right. So for me, this started kind of with just the very basics, which I'm still learning about as we get started. So broadband is a high-speed connection between homes or institutions and organizations on the World Wide Web. So for me, this meant kind of just a contrast to the way internet got started, at least at my home, where we couldn't be on the phone and on the internet at the same time. So broadband, one of the things that's nice about it, of course, is that it's on all the time and we don't have to shut off our other services to use it. It's generally faster, and in particular, the Federal Communications Commission defines it as at least 25 megabytes per second of download and 3 of upload speed. So a very specific definition. But one thing to keep in mind is that definition has evolved over time. So my understanding is that it last changed in 2015, but this change in definition makes it kind of hard to study. For an economist, for example, we like it when only one thing changes at a time so that we can see what those effects are. And as the definitions has changed and the data has changed with it, it's made it difficult to kind of keep track of, well, okay, who had broadband in 2005? Well, these households had it, but it's defined differently than it was now. So how do we look at that change? So something to be aware of when we're thinking about broadband. My understanding is that there's also a little bit of controversy in terms of how we define this. It's a little bit political. If we were to lower that threshold, it makes it look like a lot more people have broadband. My understanding is that the FCC has really resisted that because they want to kind of accurately capture whose demands are being met, but something also to keep in mind when we're thinking about broadband and how fast is it and is it enough? So the types of technology to keep in mind here. So the first three, fiber, cable, and DSL, are all wired technologies. My sense from my conversations and my learning is that fiber is really the best. It is the fastest service. It is also, from what I gather, the most expensive to implement. So there are a lot of barriers to getting fiber, particularly to rural communities. And then cable and DSL. Cable uses the same kind of technology that we would have for our television service that gives us picture and sound. DSL, I don't have the acronym there, but it will be in the Windicator that we're working on. And then two wireless technologies, wireless and then satellite. So wireless in general works from a tower. So the difference between a fixed and mobile wireless internet signal, my understanding, has to do with just like the type of tower that is transmitting that signal. My sense is that this is more common in northern Wisconsin, so where there are maybe the issue of low density comes up, so we don't have very many consumers available, that this can be a way to get some internet service. It's just not as fast, and that I hear stories of sort of these elaborate schemes to get internet, where we go to the hillside of one place to the boat out somewhere else, and that reaches this building. So these can be kind of complicated schemes to get service. So a couple just things to keep in mind here. I've also been trying to understand, how much speed is really appropriate. How much speed do we really need? And I think with both my fiance and I working from home, I'm rethinking this, as maybe a lot of you are as well. But I have found, that these online guidance of how much speed you need are a little bit optimistic, and that's my impression at least. That 5 to 40 megabytes per second. Well, it says you can have multiple devices, but I think that maybe a number of us are experiencing what happens when you have two people in the same house, both on Zoom, for example. So you're trying to video conference. So when we think about broadband, just being aware of some of these, even if you have decently fast service. I'm in central Madison. I can only imagine what this is like in some of our more remote locations. So multiple people in the household, I would say, is one thing that I've learned really kind of takes up the needs relatively quickly. So that to keep in mind, and then having some guidance here as well in terms of, what it looks like for a large institution, what kind of service needs they have. So I borrowed this from an existing extension document, but I just thought it was handy to have in mind in terms of the sort of lingo we use in talking about broadband. So we have backbone infrastructure, middle mile, and then last mile. So backbone infrastructure, my understanding is fairly well established. The backbone is there. The middle mile has been there for a lot of our communities in terms of our anchor institutions, hospitals, universities, government agencies getting service. My understanding is that most of the conversation is around last mile infrastructure. So our small businesses and houses getting adequate broadband service. So the reason that's an issue, partly at least, is kind of the low density, high cost, is that in rural areas, unlike urban areas, to get out to kind of a new region or a new geography in an urban area, maybe that would get you many, many new customers, so it makes that investment worthwhile. In a rural area, you're not able to serve as many customers, so that investment is just not feasible or profitable, desirable for a commercial internet service provider. So that's where I think a lot of the political pressure for subsidizing remote rural broadband service comes from. So there's that. So broadband coverage. So Matt has made us some really beautiful maps, of course, showing broadband coverage in the United States. So what we have here with this first graphic is households with an internet subscription broadband of any type. So what you can see here is that in Wisconsin, it's pretty good in southeast Wisconsin, kind of as you, I think you can almost draw concentric circles outside of our metro areas in terms of the amount of broadband coverage. So Chicago looks pretty good in the surrounding areas. Madison looks pretty good. As you move around Minneapolis, it looks pretty good, kind of the Green Bay area. But our northern Wisconsin communities definitely have less access to broadband service. But relative to other parts of the country, that was kind of eye-opening for me as well. Wisconsin definitely has its areas of underservice, but not nearly so severe as the South, for example. A lot of places, a lot of Appalachia without service. So this isn't a unique problem to Wisconsin. I think it looks a little different, of course, in every community, but a lot of places facing underservice when it comes to broadband. So here is the wired broadband service, so cable, fiber optic, or DSL. And here it's a little bit more severe. So some of these kind of better technologies for providing broadband service, and you can see kind of a similar pattern in that. Like it's really pretty good in the urban areas around Chicago, around Madison, around Minneapolis look pretty good. And then as you move away from these urban areas, less and less service. So especially of those better technologies. So something to keep in mind. Let's see here. Oops, excuse me. So here's a different version. So also looking at broadband intersubscription, but through a cellular data plan. And here also pretty thin through parts of Wisconsin. So as we look at these kind of different technologies, you can see the variation and where they're being used. I'm gonna take a look at the chat just in case I'm missing anything important. 1 second here. Okay, looks like haven't missed any questions quite yet. Okay, so here we have a different map. So this map is from some of our colleagues at Purdue University. So they've done some work on digital divide, digital inclusivity, really good. If you guys are looking for additional resources on broadband, I recommend looking at what Purdue has to offer. And here they've done a map of the upper Midwest. So what we're most concerned about are the red dots. So these are census blocks where 50 or more housing units have no access to this 25/3 broadband. So when I look at this, I see a lot of those red dots kind of up in northern Wisconsin, of course, but even I was sort of surprised kind of outside the Milwaukee area, it looks like it has some red. So this is an interesting problem that I'm trying to better understand, and maybe some of you on the phone can help, but it seems to be, in general, it's the case that broadband service deteriorates as we move away from metro areas, but then also some of these maps give me a lot of questions in terms of, well, it looks like there are still pockets of within metro areas where there's not a lot of service. So something to think about as well. And then this chart kind of more clearly shows, I think, the rural urban disparity. So this is the share or percent of housing units with access. So those that do have broadband by rurality. So in the completely urban areas, 99% or more typically have service across states and kind of the upper Midwest. It's really the rural areas, completely rural areas, that are hurting the most. And I think we all knew that, but to look at these numbers to me is sort of adds a little bit of clarity in that in some places like Illinois, almost half of households only have this access to broadband. In Wisconsin, we get a little closer to 2/3, but that's still a fair amount of people that don't have access to this 25/3 definition. So how did we get here? This is something that's been interesting to me. Why do we have this disparity in broadband even to begin with? So low density and high cost is definitely, one of the sort of structural barriers of the market that for a commercial internet service provider, if they're looking at what makes sense for them to invest, goes back to the problem I described earlier. In more densely populated parts of the country or parts of the state, they can enter and build that infrastructure and expect to get enough clients back on that investment that it makes sense for them to do so, that is profitable. My understanding is that commercial internet service providers have been pretty clear about in our less densely populated areas or remote areas, it just doesn't make sense for them to invest, and they likely won't do so without some sort of help. So that's where the kind of pressure for a subsidy comes into place, and some of these maybe grant and loan programs, various support to take the burden off of maybe their cost investment. And so it makes it more profitable for them. So one of the reasons that it is expensive is because of pole attachment fees. So when to build out the infrastructure, when a company is thinking about providing service, to some extent, they're augmenting existing infrastructure and attaching their line. If you were to run a fiber, they're attaching that fiber to existing telephone poles. If they don't own those poles, they're having to pay a pole attachment fee. And this is a 2017 study showing how depending on who owns those poles, the attachment fees can vary quite a bit. And these fees seem small, so $6, $11 and on up, but there are something like 18 poles per mile on average. So it is part of the cost calculus for these internet service providers. And I'm trying to understand this better as well, but this was sort of a critique of current policy making an argument for more price controls of those pole attachment fees, that municipality-owned poles and co-op poles tend to be more expensive, and that's kind of unfair, or that's discouraging of expanding service. So should it be the case that we should lower those fees or regulate that to some extent so that it's more affordable for those investments? So mapping and data, this is, I think one of the more recurring issues that I've seen come up. So generally what we know is that the FCC maps, which is the most common source of data for broadband coverage, overstate. They are going to make it look like places in the country just have more service than they do, and that's a problem. So internet service providers self-report at the census block level, and that's another thing that's changed over time. Early on, the reporting happened at the zip code level, so just kind of another layer of sort of understanding how things have changed over time and one of the challenges. But basically, they can claim coverage even if one household has access. So this is problematic, and this map is not perfect, but I think it helps me tell a story of why this is a problem. So this is Klickitat County in Washington State. This is where I grew up. And my parents still live in Goldendale, Washington, where that red star is. Klickitat County is sort of long and skinny. So on the very west end, that's butting up against the Portland, Vancouver metro area. And on the very east end, it's butting up against the Tri-Cities area, another larger metro area. So what that means is that kind of on the two ends of the county, there's a sufficiently dense population that there's quite a bit of internet service provider coverage. But right in the middle of the county where my parents live, their internet sucks, quite frankly. And it's hard for them to make the argument that they should get a grant, they should get a loan. It's hard to demonstrate need when all of these providers are able to say, yes, we provide coverage in Klickitat County. It looks as though, there are 5 or 6 providers, when really nobody is covering this very small town that's kind of in the middle of nowhere. So we end up with these sorts of challenges because of the way it's reported. Again, it's not perfect. This is reported at the census block level, but it helps demonstrate the challenges of the way the data is collected. So as I said, if these grant and loan programs such as Reconnect, I'll talk a little bit about those. if you have to show that you do not have adequate service and your go-to data source is the FCC, it just makes it hard to make the case that you, are eligible or a competitive applicant for these loans. So a challenge to think about as we think about how to get broadband access. I've also too, I don't know if this is just me, the economist, I've been trying to find a little bit more about this, but I wonder if it discourages competition. So if I'm a company thinking about providing internet service, and I'm looking at these maps to see where I might enter the market and where, I could get a lot of clients. If it looks like there are already a lot of companies providing internet service, I'm wondering if this plays a role in discouraging competition as well. Most recently, though, we did have the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technological Availability Act pass on March 23rd, so just a couple weeks ago. So President Trump signed that into law. And I've been trying to better understand this law as well. I'm wondering if anybody on the phone has more expertise, but my understanding is that this is supposed to improve the FCC reporting requirements. So hopefully this will alleviate some of the challenges that the current system presents. But I'm going to be working on kind of understanding that better for us. So some broadband opportunities. Jeff, if I can, I would love for you to speak on this. So my understanding is that 25 states have some sort of restrictions or outright laws that prohibit municipalities building their own networks, towns and cities from building their own networks. So Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, these upper Midwest states are all among those. My understanding of this is largely the result of telecom lobbying. So the big telecoms have been able to protect themselves from competition by having these laws made. And Jeff, if you're ready, I'll have you know much more than I will. I'll have you speak for a few minutes.
Yeah, happy to. In fact, I was just typing, just tell me when you want me to start.
Great.
And as I was getting ready to hit enter, you said, Jeff, you should start talking now. So hi, I'm Jeff Glazer. I was a little late to this, so apologies for that. I'm an attorney at the University of Wisconsin Law and Entrepreneurship Clinic, where we have a project that's looking at rural entrepreneurship issues. And as Tessa is very adequately pointing out, this is a huge problem. Internet access is a huge problem for entrepreneurship in rural communities. So as part of that, we've been looking at some of the laws that apply to broadband in rural communities and some of the options and business model options that they might have. One of which is this idea of municipal broadband, and sort of the general theory being that municipalities take in taxes, and they can choose to spend those taxes on a variety of public services. And wouldn't it be nice if one of those public services that taxes could help pay for was running last mile fiber out to their constituents? So there are some laws in the state of Wisconsin that apply to municipal broadband. And by and large, it makes it extraordinarily difficult for municipalities. There's the universe of politics in this is dense. So I won't really get into the politics of why it is the way that it is. But I think a fair amount of common sense and critical thinking will probably get you most of the way there, to be honest. So the basic structure of municipal broadband is the laws basically set up a framework that says municipalities can only provide broadband if there is literally no other provider and or no other provider wants to provide service there in the near future. If either of those things are true, then the municipality is not allowed to provide service. There are no speed limits on that. So even if a provider in the area is providing garbage service, that may block a municipality from even exploring the option. So, what do the statutes actually look like? First of all, the statute says that if a municipality is going to provide broadband service, first they have to undertake this feasibility study, and the statute outlines sort of everything that has to get included into this feasibility study, which is a whole litany of costs and expenses, which if you were going to present this to shareholders, you would either internalize and not really include in your financial projections, or they would sort of be a side note as capitalized costs. But in the framework of the feasibility study, the statute requires you to list all of these costs and that you have to undertake in order to even get the service started. So once you complete the feasibility study, then there are some long drawn out public notice periods. So 30 and 60 and sometimes 90 days in between meeting notices, all of which is public record. So the practical implication of this is basically if the municipality chooses to go down this route, what they're effectively doing is designing a business plan for a private entity to come in and start providing service prior to the municipality even getting through the timeline to do it. So the practical impact of these feasibility study requirements is that municipalities have to spend a lot of money in order to show whether it's financially infeasible, in which case they aren't going to do it. In fact, the law prohibits them from doing it if it's financially unfeasible. Or if it's financially feasible, there's now a public record business plan for a private entity to come in and do it. So in the alternative, instead of providing this feasibility study, the municipality can skip over this feasibility study in two cases. First, if the municipality basically goes and begs private broadband providers to allow the municipality to provide service in the community. So they have to go around to any other broadband providers that might be in the area and say, hey, do you guys want to provide service? Please say no, please say no, please say no. And if any of them say yes, not that they actually have to provide the service, but just that they're interested in providing the service, and it has to be bona fide. But as long as that interest is bona fide, then the municipality is going to be prohibited. The third possibility is that the municipalities can build out the broadband service, but they're not allowed to operate the service. And they're only allowed to build out the service if it wouldn't actually compete with more than one other service. So if there's more than one service in the community, they're not even allowed to build out the infrastructure. If there's only one service in the community, they're allowed to build out the infrastructure, but they're not allowed to actually run. They're not allowed to actually run the service itself. And if for some reason a municipality manages to get all the way through all of these barriers, they're not allowed to subsidize the service. They are only allowed to fund the service through actual subscribers. They're not allowed to fund the service through general taxes. And they must provide it at a price to exceed its total service long run incremental cost. They're not allowed to subsidize the service. Unlike private carriers who subsidize services for people all the time. So the statutory framework can make it really difficult if a municipality wants to try to provide service.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jeff. A couple of takeaways for me. One was just, with what Jeff has to say, and then also what I've been learning, the extent to which broadband in many circles isn't viewed as a public good. And maybe it shouldn't be, but I think that the nature of broadband is such that you can make the argument that it should be, that there are benefits beyond that to the individual, but the cost is so large that there are these positive externalities of us all having internet, that makes sense. There's a kind of a collective benefit. much like education. So for that reason, we might expect public investment. But if we can't use taxpayer dollars and that sort of thing, it prohibits that. So we're not really seeing it being structured in that way, which is something that I have found interesting. So anyway, thanks so much, Jeff, for sharing and being with us today. Okay, so this is just a map of some of the legal barriers. This is from Broadband Now. Their methodology has been debated, and I can publish, or not publish, but share with you the publication kind of about how they do it. But basically showing that there are a lot of states that are working around barriers, and the municipal provision has been successful in some cases, but the fact that we can't do it here is limiting, or can't do it very well, or very openly. So spending. This is another explanation in my mind for how did we get here? Why do we still have these service disparities? So the federal government has certainly spent a lot of money. The 2019 Farm Bill has $350 million for broadband-related funding, grants, and loan programs. Reconnect has I think started with $600 million in 2018 for grant and loan programs, and now there's going to be a second round funded at $550 million. The new CARES Act allocated $100 million through the Rural Utility Service for internet service. So it's certainly a lot of money. What I would say, one thing that I would say is compared to what? So here is a chart showing broadband investment compared to analogous infrastructure. So telephone service was funded differently, so we won't compare to that. But when you look at electrification in the highway system, the federal cost of implementing those services was many, many times what we've spent on broadband so far. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but when I look at this, it certainly makes sense to some extent based on these spending patterns in terms of, why we don't have full coverage, throughout all geographies in the US, part of the story here. I also think when we look at these grant programs, something I'm still trying to understand is the extent to which these programs favor kind of current providers getting additional funding. They're hard to get for smaller local entities, as what I understand. And these internet service providers, when they get a grant, because they're still trying to earn a profit in most cases, their incentive is not to use that grant to build out service to the most remote rural clients. Their incentive is to build out to the relatively densely populated rural areas. So there's just a few more clients in those spaces. So we still end up with underservice in, the most, like I said, remote and rural areas. So there do seem to be also some ways to improve these grant and loan programs. One, in terms of who's eligible to apply. Two, in terms of the data available for them to use and showing their needs, so that FCC mapping question. And then three, kind of the incentives around how that money is used. So a fair amount of money, but perhaps some ways to improve. Economic impacts. So most of you on the phone probably know my bias. There are lots of economic impacts. We can talk about telehealth, we can talk about education, we can talk about housing, all of those. Stay tuned, we're going to touch on in our upcoming Windicator. So this is kind of a long movie trailer for our coming Windicator. I'm gonna highlight here entrepreneurship, because just what I've been thinking about. With a colleague at the University of Missouri, we've been able to show what I think is pretty rigorous evidence that the places that have better access to broadband, so we're using access, not adoption, access to broadband have better entrepreneurial outcomes, particularly among the very smallest entrepreneurs and women-led businesses. So that's where we see the biggest differences based on access to broadband. So the changes, so even just kind of being slightly above average, so what we would say is one standard deviation above the mean in terms of your broadband access, that amounts to anywhere between 15% more entrepreneurs, upwards of 60% more entrepreneurs, or startup activity. I should be more specific, startup activity. So that's substantial. Those are pretty big increases, and with entrepreneurship being linked to job growth, income growth, poverty alleviation, I think that that's an important economic impact to have in mind, particularly when we get through this and start to rehabilitate our local economies. So that thinking about broadband in relationship, not just to working from home and the kind of immediate consequences we're dealing right now, but as part of our medium-term economic development strategies as well. And again, just a reminder that the CARES Act that passed has $100 million for additional grants and loans. So we can be thinking about those opportunities as well. That is where I'm going to stop. I wanted to leave plenty of time because I know several of you are working with your local communities on this. I wanted to hear from you. I've asked Melinda to share with us about Marathon County. Melinda, if you're with us. And then we just have a variety of expertise on the phone with us here too. Jeff, of course, who you heard from. I think Lynn Pittman is with us, who knows about the cooperative model. So all the makings of a great conversation. Of course, Gail with us too. So thank you for your time, and I'll just open it up for discussion.
And with that, participants should be able to unmute their mics. If you can't, just put a note in the chat box and I'll make sure that whatever control is set is corrected.
I can go first. This is Melinda. So I'm working with Marathon County, and they have recently completed their broadband feasibility study, and I put a link to our webpage there in the chat. They were finding some of the same hurdles, that they can't be a provider of broadband, and it's incredibly expensive to implement, and the ISPs don't really want to work to increase service. There may be very poor service available, but they just, again, it's the ROI isn't there. So the county is really grappling with how do they increase that return on investment for the ISPs, which is a really strange space to be in. And we're still continuing those discussions. I know that there are other people on the call that are dealing with this in their communities as well. So that's just kind of a brief update on what they've done, but you can take a look at the study. We contracted with Design 9 to complete, and they did design a network for us, but again, it's very difficult to actually construct that given the regulatory framework.
Thanks, Melinda. Chris, I know you're working on it. If you're willing to share, others of you that have experience in your local community and how it's looking there, how it's shaping up. Chris, I think you're muted. At least I can't hear you.
So Chris, it appears your mic is unmuted, but we still can't hear you.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, there we go.
That's good. All right,
Yes.
I'm taking the headphones off then. So it's the first time that's happened, so all right, something new. Ultimately, I'm curious to see if Gail, I see Gail Hike is on, and I was curious to see what Gail will have to say. There are so many things in this subject, and Tessa, you really, thank you for all the things you have said. And I want to point out that the state map that you showed early on, highlighting so much of Wisconsin in red, there was a whole bunch of things there in there I didn't realize, but that actually speaks volumes. And I think we're going to want to use that map at some point here in the future. Look, pardon me, what Melinda just said is very accurate about the ISPs. Once they deploy fiber and or wireless, however they serve the local customer to satisfy those federal, the FCC CAF2 requirements. In a lot of cases, they have not provided enough service, broadband service, to these homes, and that's the complaints that we're getting in rural areas more than anything else. Once they, and no need to mention the big providers, you know who they are, but when they service an area, they could care less. If, they're getting, they may try to deal with some customer requests, and they get a lot of customer calls and complaints all the time, but there doesn't seem to be an interest on their part. This is why we have 3 smaller telecom providers up here, 2 right here, based right here in Eagle River, and then there's 1 in Oneida County. And all of them, their broadband service recently, because of the current situation, obviously, has spiked as much as 40% right now. Meaning, so it's more needed than ever. Also, just 2 days ago, I reached out to the school district administrator for Northland Pines, so that's the whole eastern half of Vilas County that he serves, to say, Scott, are all of your students able to telecommute? Are you able to get classes right now? And he called me back, and we chatted for 15 to 20 minutes, and I know him, so I know how frustrated he is on this particular issue. And without going into all that detail, the gist of this is that he feels that about 93% of his students, that's the good news, that 93% can get something, can get at least some service. And by the way, that includes the teachers too in that. But he's putting together a survey, and I'm curious to see, I said, when you're finished with that, will you send it to me and let me know who I may share it with? He seemed to be pretty open to sharing that, but they're doing a survey to see how good is the telecom service to the students who have to telecommute right now, no choice, because there's a few who cannot. And so I'll be very curious to see the results of that. And I reminded him that technically broadband was 25 megs of download speed and 4. I think it's, I know you got 3 on there, Ted. I think it might be 4. You could check with Gail there. I think it's 4 megs. It is 3?
It's 3.
Okay. It is, okay, my mistake, 3 megs. But either way, he said, well, in that case, I think it's going to reduce it down to 10 to 20% in our area who have that. So per the definitions of broadband, that's where he's at right now. But I'm gonna if you're good, I would like to hear what Gail has to say for a minute or two. And a wonderful presentation, by the way.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, Gail.
I think we're seeing a lot of what you said, and the whole law and the struggles with how do municipalities deal with it. I think that's one of the reasons that we've really concentrated in Wisconsin on how do we develop those partnerships. And I think with the ISPs, and Chris has done a good job in the rural areas connecting with some of those. And it is difficult. Those original CAF funds that went out, as Chris said, we found that at that time when they did the applications, they were only required to do the 10 down, 1 up. And so we're already starting at behind, digging in a hole. The other thing that the major companies that received those, 3 in Wisconsin, they had to CenturyLink, AT&T, and Frontier were the 3 major, and you can see the map and the dollars that went out per municipality on the PSC site. But that was at the 10-1. What we had was benchmarks for those communities to implement and build out that broadband. And they were, every year they had to do 20%. What we're finding is that return on investment plays a huge part. It's economics for those private businesses. And the more densely populated areas are the areas that got built out. Those that are not populated, such as northern Wisconsin and some of those rural areas that we're seeing, even in the southern area that aren't as populated, those areas aren't getting built out. And from conversations that I've had with some of the CEOs, probably won't be built out. So that's some of the challenges that we meet. How do we get some of that built out? One of the things with the public service grants that we're finding, mapping has been a huge issue because we're overstating on those maps. One of the good things, at least with Wisconsin's funding, is
we're not held to that same map. We can create that story of why this is an underserved area. We've seen some great examples of community service surveys that have taken place that folks have been working on. I've read a few of those surveys, asked me to comment on some of those surveys. Our partners at UW River Falls have been working on, in the survey lab, have been working with some of those surveys. So I think that's important to tell our story, but it's also important for your communities so they know where they want to work with their ISP partners to try to build out and find some solutions. And that solution's probably going to be different. Tessa talked about the different kinds of technology, being fiber, probably, what we want to strive for, but not really attainable maybe in those last miles. So we need to look at how is that patchwork? How do we build that? You still need the fiber to get to those main towers so they can transport their data from one tower to the next. So how do we help our ISPs and our partners work together to make some of that happen? Cooperatives, I think, are a great way. I know Lynn's online, and we have a number of cooperatives that are working in the area. I've been just this last week watching my local cooperative they had dug fiber down my rural city street, and now this last week we're hanging boxes on my house. With the pandemic, they're not coming in the house to hook people up right now, but I'm at least in a rural city, but that's not going to get it out to the folks in those far out areas. And I know Lynn's work has really been concentrating on how do we take advantage of some of the lessons we've learned with cooperatives to build that out. So maybe Lynn, I think that might be a good opening for you to do some comment.
Lynn, would you mind? Could you share your thoughts? I'm putting Lynn on the spot here.
Sorry, Lynn. You just have great stuff.
Well, it's wonderful to be part of this conversation. And I think one of the things that I have heard is the change in the landscape over the years, the change in the competitive landscape over the years, and that with these different funding streams such as CAF2 that has come in, that has taken away some of the larger, potentially taken away some of the larger accounts or the more densely populated areas that can even help cooperatives do that last mile service, because they're operating under basic similar financial constraints, although they are not, their money is invested with an eye towards service, but they still need to be financially sustainable. And something else that I've heard that I don't know very much about, and I would think that maybe people on the call could sort of talk about this a little bit, is the role of anchor institutions and the other kinds of internet networks that are already in place in the state, and whether, because I have heard from comments that I've heard from telecom co-ops that some of those big accounts then could potentially have been networked into some broader broadband kinds of cooperative arrangements. And I don't know how that works. I mean, I know there are these sort of like, for instance, the services that are available to schools and to local government centers, and how that can be sort of leveraged into some of these rural networks. I don't know if people have some ideas about that. And yeah, and whether partnerships with other kinds of service-oriented enterprises like co-ops could help leverage some of the existing infrastructure out to these last mile problem areas.
The anchor institutions is one of those things that we're seeing some easing on some of the regulations at the federal level right now with E-rate and how they can disseminate and share some of their broadband space because they have E-rate funding, a special funding for their broadband services, which libraries and schools have been taking advantage of. There's been some easing of that right now with the pandemic, being able to share some of that outward. It'll be interesting to see a lot of the changes that have come with broadband that I read daily on legislative things that are out there, is how many of those easements will take place and continue after we're done with the pandemic. Whether it's allowing anchor institutions to share some of that broadband space, whether it's the regulations that will allow for us to reach that last mile with equipment. Some of the equipment easing for delivering equipment to the home. Right now, none of the federal funds has allowed us to put equipment into the homes for access for that broadband, even if it's available to help extend that. We're also seeing easement in the telehealth as far as equipment, and even being able to do telemedicine at the home has been eased somewhat right now. Some of the HIPAA regulations, they are looking at allowing some of the funds for to have monitoring devices within homes, which on the federal USDA funding before was not available. I think as we work in some of our communities, I think Chris is a good example over in Boulder Junction. We brought in my contacts from Marshfield Clinic, the virtual health director, looking at how they might work with Chris's project and what might they do together. Because what we're finding is, if you look at your neighborhood, and we encourage municipalities to do some of that planning and look at your neighborhood, you may have a K-12 student that needs broadband in order to do that homework at home. But right next door is maybe the person who needs that telehealth monitoring that the healthcare facility is trying to figure out how they're going to get services there. So being able to, and next door to that, you may have the person that is working from home and trying to do some of their selling and being an entrepreneur at home. So trying to put those groups together and build some planning. I think that's one of the things that we're working on right now, is how do we really help communities do some of that planning. Chris and I have been brought into a group with Patrick Verdun, and we're also working with DPI and Department of Administration and Public Service Commission. Because what we're seeing is, why is Wisconsin maybe not as far ahead as some of those other communities or states around us with broadband deployment, and looking at our lack of maybe an organized plan on how we move forward. And they're looking towards extension. DPI has said, we think extension has, their foot in every community. And how do we take advantage of that to build some of those strong community plans? As you take a look at the PSC grants that were just awarded, those that had good, strong community planning and partnership, such as what Chris has really worked with in Boulder Junction and Forest County, those were some of the communities that got that funding. And so we want to build on that and are looking at how we can maybe pull more extension folks in and develop our partnerships with Public Service Commission, DOA, and DPI to do that.
This is Brian. Is it okay to ask questions at this time, or?
I had a quick follow-up to Lynn's question as well, if that's all right. This is Nathan.
But if I may,
yeah.
The couple things. This might go a little rambly here a little bit, but when I was looking at the map and the fact that Wisconsin has regulations, sort of kind of wet blanket kind of scenario with municipalities and towns. When it comes to tribes being sovereign nations, I think they are going directly to FCC and dealing with some of those scenarios. With that being said, I've been working with our planning department, tribal planning department and IT department. And we do have a second provider that's interested in coming into the area. However, they're also are in a position where resources are limited, so they're looking for us to sort of help collaborate on some grant and outside resources to do that. So that's kind of going on. But I guess one of my big concerns is this is, you know, we talk about the regulations and we look at utilities, the fact that there's, you know, commissions that kind of oversee what people are getting charged for these services, et cetera. And what I've seen over the years is that it seems like if you have the resources, you can get just about any kind of connection you want if you have the money to do so. But when it comes to low income families that maybe need this just as much as anybody else, they're kind of sitting out on left field, and everybody kind of forgets that part. Sort of like, we can get the service there, but it's going to cost you a ton of money. So, and if you look at what we're under right now and the environment that we're dealing with, you know, what's more important, getting food or having, you know, a broadband access? So now you're behind the 8 ball in a whole different dynamic. With all that being said, I like the idea of us having some kind of overall strategy on how we respond to these things as a whole, as extension, because, you know, I'm just sort of putting these pieces together over the years and how we operate. Is like, if we're together moving forward, it seems like we can help move the state forward and tribes forward and all kinds of things. And if we had that strategy or a plan that we're kind of all kind of working together on, I think it'd be better for all of us. So I guess what are we seeing as maybe those parameters? I know we can do planning. A lot of us do that already. But what other things can we do to move things forward in a bigger level?
I can answer one conversation that's going to happen tomorrow that also ties into the idea of anchor institutions. Northern Michigan University up in Marquette in the UP provides to their educational community an EAN LTE network, and EAN stands for Educational Access Network. And it's a sliding scale fee. Community members can access it for $35. School partners, so members of a K through 12 community, a student, family of a student, can access it for $25. And a lower speed is available for $10 a month. It's an LTE network, so it has close to broadband speeds in some areas and broadband speeds in certain areas. But it does manage to provide a significant connection to a lot of the rural residents in the area and a lot of the lower income residents. It's called the EAN, Educational Access Network, because you have to be part of an educational community. So if you don't have a student enrolled at Northern Michigan or in a K through 12 school, you have to commit to taking one online free class every year. And they run topics from economics to family budgeting to just about any topic you can imagine. So we're going to learn more about that tomorrow, and we'll bring back some of that information to the group to see if it's a model that might patch over access in some of our communities, if it's something that we could do.
By the way, I'm coming to you from satellite.
Wow.
Kristen, you realize that some of the cans have kind of done that as a patch quilt in some areas, like Sync. They've done a partnership to do broadband to students. So one of the things, and I wanted to recognize, Tessa, you mentioned Purdue, and they had the map that highlighted the low serving counties in the state and with dark purple. And that was one of the maps I used to get the county to move forward, because it was so visual by county by county. And so one of the things that the Taylor County has been looking at, and they've been partnering with the Taylor Electric Co-op, is to do a middle mile network to recruit ISP providers. And one of the things I think that is, that you kind of mentioned that, but to understand what happens in a community like mine, I live in a county with 20,000 people, 4 of them 1,000 live in the city of Medford, and the next 10,000 live in that mile radius of the city of Medford. So what happens is the big companies come in and do the city of Medford, but they won't touch the rest of the county. And because they won't touch the rest of the county, no one can make money off of it, because you're talking about 5 people per mile. And the reason I don't have my picture on is because I am having broadband issues constantly. And so when Taylor County ventured on its feasible study and all of its stuff, next thing you know, I don't need to name the companies for putting more infrastructure into the city of Medford. 2 of them are duking it out right now. So the city of Medford is going to have amazing service, more amazing service, probably because the county started on this, and still the rest of the county will have nothing. And so there are a couple small providers that are kind of interested, and one of them has to do with that reverse auction that's going on in October with the federal government. But like I said in the chat, the funny thing about the federal government grants is we're not considered underserved compared to the West. So we always fall into these weird loopholes, and even the CANs, or the community action networks, they provide part of the problem, or fix part of the problem, but not the whole problem. Like they fix the municipality or the library or the school piece, but not the people at home. So that's what my experience has been, and it's pretty interesting.
All right, I see that we are at 1 o'clock, or 1:01 actually, and that was our scheduled end time. So let's find a way to continue this conversation, maybe through Microsoft Teams or via email. It's been great. I think that as many people have said today, and Tessa's work and Matt's maps support, there's a great need out there, and we are maybe the institution that can help push this forward for some communities. So thank you all for that. This recording will be uploaded to this Community Economic Development website probably by tomorrow afternoon, and you should be by Friday receiving updated information on how to access the next series on housing studies using the example of Waunakee, Wisconsin, which Sharon Lesberg and I will be hosting next week. So thank you, and until next week, everyone. We'll see you later.